There's a specific moment that changes everything about how you experience money. It's not when you get your first paycheck, and it's not when you land that promotion you've been chasing for months. It happens quietly, almost without you noticing, until one day you check your bank account, and instead of that familiar knot forming in your stomach, you feel something else entirely. Calm, control, maybe even confidence. For most people, that moment arrives somewhere around $25,000 in savings. And once you cross that threshold, your entire relationship with money fundamentally shifts in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it yet. My name is Adam, and I spend a considerable amount of time studying the intersection of behavioral finance, wealth psychology, and practical investment strategies. If you're interested in understanding not just how to build wealth, but how different levels of wealth actually change your decision-making process and daily experience of life, you're in the right place. Before we explore what happens after you reach $25,000, we need to understand what life looks like before it, because the contrast is what makes this milestone so transformative. Life in the before times. Picture your typical Tuesday morning. Your alarm goes off, you grab your phone, and before you're even fully awake, you're doing the mental math. Rent is due in 5 days. You've got $1,847 in your checking account. That needs to cover rent, groceries, gas, your car insurance payment, and somehow leave enough buffer that an unexpected expense won't send everything into chaos. This is what psychologists call cognitive load. Your brain is running financial calculations in the background constantly, like a computer program you can't close. Every decision throughout your day is filtered through this scarcity lens. You're at the coffee shop and you want a latte, but you order black coffee instead because that's $3 saved. You're scrolling through your email and you see that your company is hosting a weekend workshop that could be valuable for your career, but there's a registration fee. You close the email without responding because you can't afford to think about professional development when you're worried about making it through the month. Your friend texts asking if you want to grab dinner Friday night. You want to say yes, but you know that dinner will probably cost $40 once you factor in your meal, a drink, and tip. So, you say you're busy, or you're not feeling well, or you've got other plans. The lie feels necessary because admitting you can't afford it feels worse. This is the reality for millions of people. They're not financially irresponsible. They're not making terrible choices. They're operating within a system where one unexpected car repair, one medical bill, one anything could unravel months of careful planning. Research from the Federal Reserve shows that roughly 40% of Americans couldn't cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing money or selling something. Think about that for a moment. $400. That's less than most people spend on their monthly car payment, but for nearly half the population, it represents a potential crisis. When you're living in this state, your brain operates in what neuroscientists call threat detection mode. Your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for processing fear and anxiety, is more active. Your prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-term planning and strategic thinking, gets less resources. Your body is literally wired to focus on immediate survival rather than future optimization. This manifests in tangible ways throughout your life. You take the first job offer that comes along, even if the salary is lower than you deserve, because you can't afford to wait for something better. You stay in a living situation that isn't ideal because moving requires upfront costs you don't have. You avoid going to the doctor for that persistent pain because the copay feels like too much right now. The cruel irony is that these survival-based decisions often perpetuate the cycle. You can't invest in yourself because you're too busy surviving. You can't take calculated risks because you have no margin for error. You can't think strategically about your future because you're consumed with managing your present. And perhaps most significantly, you develop what behavioral economists call present bias. When every dollar is precious and every expense feels like a threat, you become hyper-focused on the immediate term. The concept of saving for retirement or building long-term wealth feels abstract almost laughable when you're trying to figure out how to pay for groceries. The threshold. So what makes $25,000 different? Why does this particular number create such a dramatic shift? The answer lies in what this amount of money actually represents in practical terms. $25,000 is roughly 3 to 6 months of living expenses for most middle-income Americans. It's enough to cover the vast majority of unexpected emergencies that derail people financially. And critically, it's enough to fundamentally change your brain's perception of safety. When you have $25,000 in savings, you've crossed over from survival mode into something different. Not abundance, not wealth, but security. And security is the foundation upon which everything else is built. The first thing that changes is your stress response system. Studies on financial stress have shown that having adequate emergency savings can reduce cortisol levels by as much as 20%. This isn't just about feeling less anxious. Lower cortisol means better sleep, improved immune function, clearer thinking, and better emotional regulation. Your brain quite literally starts working differently. Instead of constantly scanning for threats, your mind has bandwidth to consider opportunities. Instead of asking, "How do I survive until next Friday?" you start asking, "What do I want to build over the next 5 years?" This shift from defensive to offensive thinking is subtle but profound. I remember talking to someone who described the moment they realized they had crossed this threshold. They were at work, and their manager made an unreasonable request that would require them to work through the weekend. Before having savings, this person would have immediately agreed, terrified of any friction that might jeopardize their job. But in this moment, they paused. They calmly explained that they had prior commitments and couldn't accommodate the request. And when their manager pushed back, they held firm. Nothing catastrophic happened. In fact, their manager respected the boundary. But more importantly, this person had discovered something crucial. They had leverage. Not because they were suddenly wealthy, but because they weren't desperate. This psychological shift affects every domain of your life. Financial security creates the space for you to make better decisions across the board. The practical transformation. Let's walk through what daily life actually looks like once you've built this foundation. You're at the grocery store, and you're no longer doing mental arithmetic on every item you put in your cart. This doesn't mean you're buying caviar and imported cheeses without thinking, but you're choosing food based on what you actually want to eat and what aligns with your health goals, not purely on what costs the least. You might buy the organic vegetables because you care about that, or you might buy the conventional ones because you don't. Either way, you're making the decision from a position of choice rather than constraint. Your car makes a strange noise. Before, this would trigger an immediate stress response. You'd be calculating whether you could put off dealing with it, whether you'd need to put it on a credit card, whether this was going to spiral into a major crisis. Now, it's an inconvenience. You schedule an appointment with a mechanic, you pay for the repair, and you move on with your life. The money is replaced through your normal savings rhythm over the next month or two. This shift from crisis to inconvenience is one of the most significant quality of life improvements that money can buy at this level. Your career dynamics change dramatically. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, every interaction with your employer is tinged with underlying desperation. You can't effectively negotiate salary because you're afraid they'll rescind the offer. You can't push back on unreasonable demands because you need the job more than they need you. You can't explore other opportunities because taking time off for interviews feels too risky. But $25,000 changes the entire calculus. You now have what I think of as strategic runway. If something went wrong with your job tomorrow, you could survive for several months while you found something better. This doesn't mean you become reckless or combative at work, but it does mean you negotiate from a position of strength rather than fear. And here's what's fascinating. The moment you stop appearing desperate, people start treating you differently. Confidence is attractive in professional settings. When you show up knowing that you have options, your employer takes you more seriously. You're more likely to get that raise you've been wanting. You're more likely to be considered for promotions. You're more likely to be included in important projects. The safety net doesn't just protect you from disaster, it actively creates opportunities that wouldn't exist otherwise. Consider what becomes possible when you have this foundation. Maybe you learn about a professional certification that costs $3,000, but could increase your annual salary by $8,000. Before, this is impossible. The upfront cost is simply too large relative to your available resources. But with $25,000 saved, you can run the math. Spend $3,000 now, recoup it within 5 months through higher earnings, and benefit from that raise for years to come. The return on investment is obvious when you have the capital to invest. Or perhaps you hear about a rental property that's undervalued because it needs some cosmetic work. A strategic investor could buy it, put in $10,000 of improvements, and own an asset that generates cash flow for decades. Before reaching this threshold, you can only watch these opportunities pass by. After, you can actually evaluate whether they make sense for your situation. This is what wealthy people mean when they talk about money creating more money. It's not some mystical force. It's simply that having capital gives you access to opportunities that broke people can't participate in, no matter how intelligent or hardworking they are. The philosophy behind the numbers. There's something deeper happening when you save your first $25,000 that transcends the money itself. You're fundamentally changing your identity. Think about what it actually requires to accumulate this amount starting from zero. Unless you're earning an unusually high income or living in an extremely low-cost situation, this demands real discipline. You had to track your spending with precision. You had to distinguish between wants and needs, often choosing the need when the want was more appealing. You had to maintain this behavior consistently for months or years, even when friends were taking vacations you couldn't afford or buying things that looked appealing. Most significantly, you had to develop the capacity for delayed gratification. This is perhaps the single most valuable financial skill anyone can cultivate, and it's also one of the most difficult to develop. There's a famous psychology study from Stanford in the 1970s called the marshmallow experiment. Researchers put young children in a room with a marshmallow and told them they could eat it now or wait 15 minutes and get 2 marshmallows. Some children ate the marshmallow immediately. Others found ways to resist temptation. Years later, the researchers followed up with these children as adults. The ones who had demonstrated delayed gratification as children had better outcomes across virtually every life domain. Better grades, better careers, better relationships, better health. Saving $25,000 is your adult version of the marshmallow test. And by reaching this milestone, you've proven to yourself that you're capable of prioritizing long-term outcomes over short-term pleasure. This isn't just a financial accomplishment. It's a character development that affects every subsequent decision you make. You become the type of person who thinks in terms of opportunity cost. When you're considering a purchase, you don't just think about whether you can afford it. You think about what else that money could become if deployed differently. That $40,000 car isn't just $40,000. It's $40,000 that could grow to over $200,000 in your investment account over 20 years at reasonable return rates. Suddenly, driving a reliable used car doesn't feel like a sacrifice. It feels like a strategic choice that's funding your future freedom. This mindset extends beyond large purchases. You start evaluating everything through the lens of long-term impact rather than immediate gratification. But here's something important that people often miss. This isn't about becoming a miser who never enjoys anything. It's about becoming intentional. When you have clear financial goals and understand the mathematics of compound growth, you naturally gravitate towards spending money on things that truly matter to you while cutting expenses on things that don't. You might discover that you don't actually care about having a luxury car, but you deeply value international travel. So you drive a 10-year-old Honda and take 2 overseas trips per year. Or maybe you realize that living in a smaller apartment is fine, but having a state-of-the-art home office dramatically improves your quality of life and productivity. So you optimize your housing costs and invest in your workspace. The point is that you're making these choices consciously rather than defaulting to whatever your peers are doing or whatever advertisements tell you to want. The career leverage effect. Let's examine more closely what happens to your professional life once you have this foundation, because the impacts are more dramatic than most people anticipate. There's a concept in negotiation theory called BATNA, which stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. Essentially, it's your walkaway option. The stronger your BATNA, the more power you have in any negotiation. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, your BATNA is terrible. If a salary negotiation goes poorly, you might lose the job offer and face immediate financial crisis. If you push back on unreasonable demands from your current employer, they might fire you, and you'd be devastated. Your weak BATNA forces you to accept suboptimal terms because you don't have alternatives. But $25,000 in savings transforms your BATNA overnight. If a negotiation fails, you'll be fine for several months while you find something else. If your current employer becomes unreasonable, you can afford to leave. This doesn't mean you become confrontational or difficult. It means you negotiate from a position of genuine choice rather than desperation. And here's what's remarkable. You often don't need to use this leverage. Just having it changes your demeanor in subtle ways that others pick up on subconsciously. You speak with more confidence. You're less apologetic. You're willing to advocate for yourself. People respect this, and they often give you what you're asking for simply because you demonstrated that you're serious. I've seen people receive raises of $10,000 or more simply because they finally had the confidence to ask for them. The employer had the budget all along. The work was already worth that much, but the employee never asked because they were too afraid of the consequences. Once they had savings, the risk of asking felt manageable, and they were rewarded for it. This compounds over a career in staggering ways. Let's say you get a $10,000 raise at age 30 because you had the confidence to negotiate. That's not just $10,000. It's $10,000 per year for the rest of your career, plus all the percentage increases that are calculated based on your salary. Over a 35-year career, that single negotiation could be worth $500,000 or more in lifetime earnings. Financial security doesn't just protect you, it multiplies your earning potential by giving you the confidence to advocate for your worth. The path forward. So where do you go from $25,000? What's the next milestone, and how does the journey evolve? The next meaningful threshold for most people is $100,000. This is where compound interest really starts becoming visceral. At 8% returns, $100,000 generates $8,000 per year in investment gains. That's meaningful money that you can see and feel working for you. Getting from $25,000 to $100,000 takes discipline, but it's not as daunting as going from $0 to $25,000. You've already built the habits. You've already developed the identity of someone who saves and invests. Now you're just maintaining that behavior and watching the mathematics work in your favor. After $100,000, the next major milestone is probably $250,000. At this level, you're generating roughly $20,000 per year in investment returns. For many people, that's enough to cover a significant portion of their basic living expenses. You're not financially independent yet, but you can see it from here. The beautiful thing about this progression is that each milestone becomes progressively easier to reach, not because you're working harder, but because your previous savings are doing more of the work. The boulder you've been pushing uphill is now starting to roll on its own momentum. But here's what I want you to understand above everything else. The specific dollar amounts matter less than the principles behind them. Whether your personal threshold is $15,000 or $25,000 or $40,000 depends on your cost of living and life situation. The number itself is less important than what it represents. What you're really building is the capacity to delay gratification, the ability to think long-term, the discipline to maintain consistent behavior even when it's difficult. These characteristics will serve you far beyond your financial life. The person who can save their first $25,000 has developed the mental frameworks necessary to build significant wealth over time. They've proven they can resist temptation. They've demonstrated they can maintain discipline. They've shown they can think beyond immediate gratification. And perhaps most importantly, they've experienced what financial security feels like. They know the difference between survival mode and strategic mode. They understand how different their brain works when they're not constantly worried about money. And once you've experienced that shift, you'll never want to go back to living paycheck to paycheck. The real freedom. Let me end by talking about what $25,000 in savings actually represents at its deepest level. It's not about the stuff you can buy. It's not about feeling wealthy or impressing anyone. It's about reclaiming your time and attention. When you're not constantly worried about money, you have mental space to think about what actually matters to you. You can consider what you want your life to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. You can pursue interests that don't have immediate financial payoff because you're not in survival mode anymore. You can invest in relationships without the underlying tension that financial stress creates. You can be more present with your family and friends because you're not always mentally calculating expenses. You can take better care of your health because you can afford to see doctors and buy nutritious food without stress. This is what financial security really buys. Not luxury items or status symbols, but presence and peace of mind. If you're starting from zero right now, that's completely fine. Everyone starts from zero. The key is starting and maintaining consistency even when progress feels slow. Save what you can, invest it wisely, and protect your foundation once you've built it. The person you become while saving your first $25,000 is infinitely more valuable than the money itself. You're developing the habits, mindset, and discipline that will serve you for the rest of your life. That transformation starts with a single decision to take your financial future seriously. And if you make that decision today, you'll look back years from now, barely recognizing the person you used to be, living paycheck to paycheck, constantly worried about money. Your future self is counting on the decisions you make right now. Make them wisely,